Berlin. Some things you don't tell just anybody, maybe because you don't trust anybody, or you don't trust yourself to tell the truth, or because you don't think it's important, or you don't think nobody cares. You keep the story to yourself, and this in some way does you harm. The story gets heavy. You don't like carrying it around. If only you could chuck it in the ocean. But you can't do that, because it's part of your past, a piece of your identity, and you don't want to let yourself go. Renata was just such a story. I met her in Berlin. I'd been in Berlin as a teenager with my parents, and I'd been there the year before to visit a girlfriend. The gloomy city seemed full of history. It seemed like stepping back in time before the First World War. I'd gotten sick of Greece, where I'd been the past 8 months. The same blue sky every day, the same sun. I got tired of lying on the beach. I needed some culture. What a switch. From wine under the grape leaves to coffee and dingy stand-up cafes. At first I didn't know where I'd live. I tried a friend of the old girlfriend, but he couldn't help, and she was gone. My German not great, though we'd lived in Germany for 2 years, 10 years before. That was as an army brat, and we lived on bases. However, I managed to muddle my way around, and for some reason, I wanted to have nothing to do with Americans. Then, one day, at the university dining hall, I discovered an ad on the bulletin board. A student was going to England for the winter. She wanted to sublet her room. I went around to her place in the district called Wedding. The deal was soon sealed. She had a friend upstairs who would help if I needed help. The room had its own, its own entrance, a sink, a hot plate, a closed-off toilet, and no refrigerator. But that was no problem. I could buy fresh every day. Plenty of small stores in the neighborhood. I must admit, as I say all this seems like a dream to me now. At the time I took everything as natural, putting one foot in front of the other, one desire in front of the other. I wanted experience. I thought every writer needed to have had experience. And I did a lot of things just for the adventure of it. I did a lot, but I wasn't, as a result, very sensitive with people. This came out with Renata, the girl upstairs. In those days, I wanted to make it with any halfway attractive woman I could. Renata must have sensed this, for she resisted a long time. And when she finally gave in to her own desires, she had to drink a lot of alcohol to do it. Not that she needed an excuse to drink. She did a lot of drinking just to get her through the day. She liked schnapps, a clear drink like vodka, and she'd drink half a bottle a day. She smoked a lot, too. I don't know how I ever kissed her. For a non-smoker to kiss a smoker is like kissing an ashtray. But in those days, my desire a lot more powerful than my discretion. And as I say, and today I mean it, I was an insensitive lout, doing everything for experience. And besides, Renata, short, dark-haired, very witty and very intelligent, a medical student. She'd learned to type, for example, by typing the collected poems of Gottfried Benn. True, Benn's poems a bit grim, mice finding homes in corpses, that sort of thing, because he too a doctor, one specializing in cases of ED. He must have seen the underbelly of life. I remember going with Renata to classes one day. The doctor would speak, then a patient would be brought out, talked about, then examined by the students. Most patients were embarrassed. Some hadn't realized this would happen when they came to this particular hospital. It was cheaper as a result. I remember one middle-aged woman had a rash on her legs. She ended up upended on a table, a multitude of students staring down between her thighs. Most of all, though, I remember the worker patient. He described how he'd been putting plaster on a ceiling when he became unable to lift anything over his head. This patient, charming and funny, very accommodating. He liked being on stage, the center of attention. After he left, the doctor said with a slight smile, "He's finished." I thought I was in a Nazi concentration camp. That's how it felt. The affair with Renata went up and down. I met her parents, who talked about how difficult it was to get anything after the war. Her mother wanted to be a pianist. Renata identified with her mother and felt a lot of conflict with her father, a short, balding businessman. Renata, too, had a piano. I think she really wanted to be an artist. I'd walk into the apartment house courtyard at night after going to a movie. I went to movies almost every night to improve my German. And I'd hear her playing furiously up in her room. She never thought she was good enough. She played the piano a lot. Most of the time I'd go to museums, to the public bath, to shower, to cafes, to the libraries at the America House or the British Legation. I worked on a play about Nietzsche. In fact, early one Sunday morning, I just finished an hallucination scene where the sick Nietzsche tossed up in the air by a bunch of wounded soldiers, when there was a knock on the door. A policeman stood there. He smiled. He handed me a telegram from my mother. "Your father died today. Please call home." I was stunned. It was totally unexpected. My father was young. He'd been sending me some money. I stood there with 1,000 thoughts going through my mind, and I stood back like a writer, even in that moment, watching in wonder my racing mind. I tried to tell the policeman my father had died, but he just smiled and waved his hand and walked away. What could I do? I raced up to Renata's and trembled before her door. She said, smiling, "So soon?" She never let me stay at her place. I had to go down, even after we made love. I handed her the telegram and pushed past her into the room. I stood looking out the window at the rooftops, almost unable to breathe. She came up behind me and she said she was sorry. I said that was all right. I had to tell someone. I left for the telephone office. My mother said she didn't expect me to come home. Later, my brother said my mother ran hot and cold, 1 minute sobbing, the next minute calm and collected. They'd been in the middle of a divorce. He'd died of a heart attack. Later, I got a couple of $1,000 in insurance money. It meant I could stay in Europe longer if I wanted, and I did. The affair with Renata didn't develop beyond a certain point. She liked my being a poet, but she'd have to get very drunk before she could get affectionate. Drunk, she'd dress up, put on makeup, come down as a sexual fireball, and fall asleep in my arms. It wasn't enough. In those days, I lived mostly by fantasy. I had to imagine my way into love, and this time I couldn't do it. I finally left for England, but this wasn't the end, not yet. Back in California, a year or two later, yes, 2 years, I still yearned for Europe. When I arrived in Luxembourg, I sent Renata a telegram and grabbed a train for Berlin. When I arrived, she seemed ill at ease. She'd just had an intense affair with a student who'd returned to Peru 6 months before. I didn't really have time to assess the situation. She said I could stay there and she'd stay at her parents'. She left, and 3 days later she still hadn't come back. I finally got furious. I didn't know where her parents lived or their phone number. Besides, I tend to be passive in confrontational situations like this. I took my bag to a student hostel where I came down with the flu. For several days I couldn't stand light or motion, though oddly enough I remember those Huge black horses being exercised in the snow and the twilight in the field next to the hostel. Did I imagine it all? It seemed like a dream. I finally went back to Renata's to say goodbye. She tried to explain her anxiety. She stood by my chair, wanting some hint, some touch of affection, but I was too angry. I left, and I left Europe too. I've never been back. 2 years later, one of my letters to Renata came back stamped Verstorben, deceased. On the envelope was a note saying Renata had been found dead in her bed. I'm sure she took poison. One of her student friends had taken poison and been saved. Renata thought they should have let her die. If a person wanted to take their life, they should be allowed to do so. Later still, after I received the letter, my mother told me Renata had tried to reach me the year before. Perhaps that had been her last attempt at life.